I am the Space Quest historian. Today we're continuing our quest to catalog the many dick moves of Space Quest. In the last episode, we took a look at Space Quest 3, which was actually surprisingly chill in this regard, especially compared to its two predecessors, but its sequel, Space Quest 4, Roger Wilco and the Time Rippers from 1991, brought back the art of viciously dick-slapping the player like it was going out of style. In fact, you could go so far as to argue that Space Quest 4 doubles down so hard on the proverbial penile punishments that you'd think the designers were making up for lost time or something. In fact, there are so many in this game that running down an exhaustive list would be quite the monumental task, so I'm just gonna rattle off the ones that I find the most insidious, because otherwise we'd be here all day. Space Quest 4 is a game where you can never relax, because everything is trying to kill you, at all times. There are precious few moments of respite where you're not on a timer or being chased by something that wants you dead, and for the most part you'd better be on your feet and alert or suffer the dire consequences. The first dig move comes very early in the game, right in the starting area, with this strange little cylindrical object, and its purpose is very simple. It's here to let you know that the gloves are off, and Space Quest 4 is not here to fuck around. If you pick up this thing, which the game describes as an unstable ordnance, and then proceed to the next area by climbing into the sewer, you'll die in a spectacular explosion. Now, granted, the game does tell you that carrying this thing around is a bad idea, and the mistake of letting that warning go unheeded pays off mere moments later instead of half a game later, so on that front, as far as dick moves go, this is letting players off light. It serves as a warning of things to come, a precautionary dick move, if you will. But from a game design standpoint, it's actually pretty vicious, even in its simplicity, because right off the bat, Space Quest 4 gleefully violates the established unspoken contract between adventure game and adventure game players by punishing you for picking up an item. Adventure games expect you to pick up everything you can, and if a game lets you take something with you, it's usually a sign that it will come in useful later on. But the unstable ordnance actively punishes you for doing so, and it's one of the first items you find in the game that you can pick up. Psychologically speaking, this is a tremendous and fairly insidious way of striking fear into the heart of the player. It sends a very clear message that you can't trust this game. Now you don't know if something else you may pick up later down the line will actually harm you instead of help you. One of the most basic ingrained rules of adventure gaming have now been turned upside down, and only one thing is for certain: this game does not have your back. It's out for blood, it wants you dead, and it will do whatever it takes to make sure it gets what it wants. And things don't exactly improve in your favor once you make it all the way up to the supercomputer's landing pad. Here you have only a few seconds while these two mechanized minions mumble away at each other to steal your first time pod. Never mind the fact that the timer here is very strict to the point of being unforgiven, and it's an instant game over if you stop to do anything other than click the hand icon on the time pod as soon as you regain control of Roger. Once you get in there, that's when the game starts getting really diabolical on your ass and begins setting you up for failure in earnest. Everything else prior to this moment was just a practice run. This is where the game drops a ticking bomb in your lap and runs off to cover its ears with an ear-to-ear grin on its face. There's a keypad in front of you. You've just nicked this thing. You'd be forgiven for thinking you're just seconds away from getting rumbled, even though you are in fact perfectly safe for the time being. But you don't know that, so your first instinct, of course, is to start pressing buttons and get the fuck out of Dodge. But not so fast. See this code on the display? Yeah, you're meant to write this thing down. If you don't write it down, you can't finish the game. If you hit a single button on the keypad, the whole thing clears away and you'll never get it back. And oh, the code is random every time you play the game, so you can't even look up a walkthrough to help you later down the line. If you don't write down this code, you can get about 90% of the way through the game before you realize you're in a dead end and the game is now completely unwinnable. In fact, you'd better have a pen and paper ready throughout the entire game, or be ready to take screenshots, because all the time codes in the game, save for 2, are randomized for every playthrough. The only exceptions are the time code for Space Quest 1, which you piece together using 2 inventory items that are always the same on each playthrough, and the first time code that you enter, which takes you to the next section of the game in Space Quest 10, which you just have to guess. The game is actually hard-coded to always accept the second random code you enter as the correct one for getting to the next section. The first one will always fail, and the second one will always work. Whatever you enter as the second code is then set as the time code for getting to Space Quest 10 in the future. Of course, as the player, you don't know that. All you know is that you entered a random code, and for some reason it worked. How's that for not holding your hand? Now, I could just end the video right here because this whole business of having to write down the time codes that you don't know will become important until hours later is already a pretty severe smack right across the forehead, but we're just getting started. When you get to your next destination, the scenic buttes of Estros in Space Quest 10, unbeknownst to you, you're now on a timer. If you spent too much time here walking around and taking in the scenery, the sequel policeman from before will teleport in to wreck your shit. Now, under the right circumstances, you can actually avoid them and get to the next section of the game if you make it back to your time pod. In fact, I made a whole video about how to do that. And the timer that causes these two dudes to teleport in is actually pretty lenient, so it's not like you're in a major rush. But these guys don't play fair, and if they do show up, they will sometimes just magically teleport right in front of you to serve up an untimely laser blast to the forehead. In fact, making it back to your time pod is so difficult and really is more a matter of luck than skill. So, for all intents and purposes, these two sequel policemen are, and were most likely intended as, an unavoidable death sentence. Right, next up is the nest. You're meant to hitch a ride on this pterodactyl and get unceremoniously dumped into its nest, presumably as a future snack for the winged menace. Once again, you'd be forgiven for thinking you're in a hurry because this thing might come back at any moment, but the truth is, it never actually returns to see how you're doing. But here's the kicker. If your nerves are understandably frazzled at this point and you make a quick exit through the hole in the side of a nest here, you're once again screwed. Against all common sense, you're actually meant to wait around for this sequel policeman to fall out of the sky and impale himself on the branches. Because this guy's carrying half of that time code I mentioned earlier for Space Quest 1, which you'll need later. But if you leave the nest before picking up the scrap of paper he's carrying, you're once again shit out of luck. And what's really cruel about this one is that they actually did plan to show a bit of mercy here and let you go back and get it if you missed it the first time, but at the end of the day, they just decided not to bother with that anyway. There's evidence in the game's resources to suggest that you should be able to return to the nest because there's an unused sprite of the sequel policeman here decomposing in the sun, but you'll never see this in-game because once you've visited the nest, you'll never be able to go back. Because what happens next is, once you leave the nest, you fall into the water below and get carried off by the latex babes to the next section of the game in their underground lair. But the thing in the game's code that triggers their appearance is just a simple check for what screen you were previously on. If it was the nest, then boom, there they are. And that means that if you were able to return to the nest, the latex babes would show up every time you left the nest. And since that would be awfully repetitive, whoever programmed this section of the game just decided to only let the pterodactyl show up and carry you off to its nest once. That's right, if you return to this spot later in the game, even if you use the time pod to travel to another time period and then back here again, the pterodactyl never shows up. And you know, it would have been trivial to just put in a check to see if the latex babes had already shown up once before, same as what they apparently did with the pterodactyl, but for whatever reason, be it cruelty, laziness, or just a plain oversight, one trip is all you get. And once you clear a few more instant game over timed events that I won't bother going into here, Roger is whisked away to the Galaxy Galleria shopping mall. And at first, things seem alright here. I mean, for once, there's nothing lurking in the shadows trying to kill you, and you have all the time in the world to explore your surroundings and figure out how to progress from here. Once you've done all you need to do, the sequel policemen spawn in the arcade, and it's off to the races again with another PTSD-inducing section that I'm sure we're all familiar with at this point. But hold up, before we get to that, there's a notable difference in this section depending on what version of the game you're playing. If you're playing the CD-ROM version, you might accidentally spawn the sequel policeman in the arcade prematurely because, again for unknown reasons, they changed the condition for how to trigger their appearance between the disc version and the CD-ROM release. In fact, it's worth mentioning that the CD-ROM version introduces a whole host of exclusive dick moves, most of them owing to the bewildering reprogramming they did of how timers in the game work. Long story short, if your computer was just a little bit on the fast side, a slew of timed puzzles in this game would be rendered excruciatingly difficult, if not flat out impossible. Case in point, the arrival of the sequel policeman triggers the infamous CD-ROM sequence. You guys knew this was coming. And this section is indeed infamous because it is by far the most broken section of the game in the CD-ROM version. Because in the disc version it's actually fine. You have ample time to float your ass across the skating rink and come out the other side to steal the sequel policeman's time pod. But in the CD-ROM version, there's a good chance these guys will just show up to shove a laser blast up your ass before your feet have even left the ground. But to what I'm assuming is everyone's surprise, I'm actually not going to chalk up the CD-ROM as a dick move, because the whole business with the timer being all fucked up was actually entirely unintentional. The sequence wasn't meant to be intentionally more difficult in the CD-ROM version, it's just a byproduct of shoddy programming. So yeah, the CD-ROM, believe it or not, gets a pass in my book. But changing the condition for when these assholes show up in the first place doesn't. In the disc version, you are required to complete every step that you can possibly take in the mall, including some extraneous ones that aren't actually important in order to finish the game, before they'll show up. This includes everything from getting a new outfit at the Big and Tall store, getting a job at Monolith Burger, and buying a dress from the Saks store so you can clean out Zondra's ATM card, and most importantly, buying the Space Quest 4 hint book in the software store, so you actually have the second half of the time code for getting to Space Quest 1. Yeah, we're still not done with that one. But in the CD-ROM version, you don't need to do any of that. The only criteria for spawning the sequel policeman in the arcade in this version are A, buying a new outfit at Big and Tall, and B, walking around to the back of the arcade. That's it. And once again, if you manage to bag their time pod before you've had a chance to properly explore them all, you'll now be stuck here because you need one half of the code from the hint book at the software store and the other half from Mr. Skewer over here. But that means if you sequence break this whole section at the mall, you can go through the whole ordeal of trying to outrun them through the 0G skating rink, come out the other side, steal their time pod, and then where do you go? I mean, if you haven't got the two pieces of the time code, you've nowhere else to go except somewhere you've already been. So once again, this whole mechanic of having to punch in time codes to progress in the game rears its ugly head to dick slap you once again. Now, granted, as I mentioned before, this particular code you're meant to use to travel to Space Quest 1 is the only one in the game that's the same every time you play. But you have to remember, when this game came out in 1991, first-time players didn't know any of this shit. And there's more than a good chance that the large majority of these players got up to this part jubilantly excited after just beating what is universally considered the most brutal section of the game, only to find that they were now stuck in another dead-end situation. Okay, let's skip ahead and talk about the end of the game, because once you get back to Space Quest 12 to take on the big supercomputer and win the game actually turns surprisingly merciful. Once you get inside the big supercomputer for the final confrontation, you're pretty much on rails until the end of the game. And if you miss any of the items you need in order to get into the supercomputer, like this corrosive slime in the sewer and this cigar butt the Monolith Burger manager throws after you inevitably fail the burger making minigame, the game actually lets you go back and get them, again assuming you remember to write down all the necessary time codes. There's just one last gauntlet of agony to get past involving these roaming droids that takes some practice to get past until you figure out how to cheese their predictable pattern, and once you flush them out of existence and set the computer to format, the game then throws a timer at you that lasts all the way until the final cutscene. But it's doable, and it's not really anywhere near the gleefully sadistic dick moves I've described previously. So it comes as no surprise that my pick for the biggest dick move in Space Quest 4 is this whole fucking business of having to write down the time codes, especially the first time you steal the time pod, because you get in and you start punching in fucking digits and the thing just clears away and you'll never see it again, and you need this time code to go back to Space Quest 12 at the end of the game. And if you didn't write it down the first time, which is like literally 10 to 15 minutes into the game, you're absolutely irrevocably fucked. So yeah, that's my unsurprising pick for the biggest dick move in Space Quest 4, even though the game has ample examples of how to dick slap you around. But anyway, here ends the parade of dick moves that is Space Quest 4. Next time, we'll dive into everyone's favorite Saturday morning cartoon version of Space Quest, the 5th game in the series, which, despite its cutesy and cuddly surface demeanor, actually has a few nasty tricks up its sleeve. Not a lot, but a few. But for right now, take care, And
see ya on the Chrono Stream, time jockey.
yeah, alright, yeah. That